My first few writing projects were contemporary, and I was afraid to jump into the realm of writing fantasy because I thought it would be a lot more difficult to write. While I'm not sure if that's necessarily true, each genre definitely has its own challenges. Today I'm breaking down my top 4 ways that writing fantasy is different. First is word count. Generally, stories over 40 to 50,000 words are considered novels, though it'll depend on who you ask, and these are only loose qualifications anyway. A standard word count for novels is in the 60 to 80,000 word range, with many genres landing in the 80 to 90,000 word range. There are, of course, always exceptions, from individual books to whole subgenres. So for fantasy, and especially adult fantasy, but also most YA, you will find that 80,000 words is a bit on the short side. And of course, if we're talking epic fantasy, then most readers are expecting books over the 100,000 word mark, with most landing between 100 and 120,000 words. Now, the first in a series is more likely to be shorter, but the rest in a series can definitely exceed 120 by a lot. Now, obviously, there's no strict rule for this, but what readers are expecting is something that we writers have to keep in mind if we're considering publishing. When writing a contemporary, something in the range of a 60,000 word book is going to be considered totally normal. For YA, at least. For adult books, it might be a little bit higher, but that would still be acceptable. So as a slow drafter, just a 60,000 word book was difficult for me to write. When I started writing fantasy, one of the things I was most worried about was that daunting word count. If something at 60,000 words takes me a long time to write, what is 80, 90, 100,000 words going to take me? Well, I'm a slow drafter. I have always been a slow drafter. I'm currently trying to not be a slow drafter, but so writing something outside of that comfortable 60 to 80,000 word range was a little bit difficult. Now, word count, of course, doesn't always equate to more difficulty or time to write. There are always factors such as planning, life, and structural changes to the story as you're writing it that can make something that is less words take longer to write than something that is more words. But if you're a slow drafter like me, more words is pretty much always going to mean more time drafting and more time editing. Next is world building. Keeping track of your characters and plot in a contemporary book is difficult enough. But when you add fantasy world building into that mix, it is definitely enough to make your head spin. World building is, unfortunately, something I had to learn a lot about through trial and error. Learning how much is too much and where to add and where to take away, what elements will enhance the story and what elements will slow things down, along with things like what is going to cause potential plot holes down the road. All these things were enough to make me question my ability to write. Though sci-fi and fantasy are very similar in this regard. There's a lot of information to keep straight, both in your own notes and for the reader. Organizing world building and learning how to weave it into the storytelling is really difficult. Info dumping is so common in fantasy, I think, because of this. There can be so much backstory that the reader needs to know, or that we think the reader needs to know, that it can be really tempting to throw a history lesson in the middle of a scene sometimes. I mean, you should probably not do that, but sometimes it feels like you need to. I had to make a whole video series here on YouTube talking about all the little world building lessons that I've learned. I'll link it up in the cards if you'd like to watch. And I still feel like there is stuff that I haven't covered. I'm not sure what, but I feel like it's a lot of bringing the world building into the writing that I haven't gone through. Next is magic. I did separate this one from world building, even though magic systems are a type of world building, just because it is so important and so different from anything else that you'll find in different types of books. The amount of possible plot holes that magic introduces into a story is ridiculous, and figuring out how to totally lock those down and make sure they do not mess up your story is kind of a big task. Okay, I want the characters to be able to levitate objects. Cool. Can they levitate other people? Can they levitate themselves? So they can fly. If they can fly, why do they walk anywhere? It's kind of endless. Creating a magic system is probably one of the best parts about writing fantasy for me, though. But writing magic is really difficult, too. You have to be so specific in creating rules for it. At least if we're talking about a hard magic system, which is what I think a lot of the main characters in a fantasy story will usually have to deal with. Of course, sometimes your fantasy will only have soft magic systems used by outside people, like not the main characters, but if we're talking about a hard magic system that the main characters use, this is what I mean. And you have to be able to condense all that information into digestible information that the reader can remember, while also not boring them with details and figuring out how to weave these rules into the storytelling. You also have to come up with ways to describe the magic, which I was definitely worried about in the beginning, but it turned out to not be that big of a deal for me. But you do have to keep a certain level of consistency with this so that you can describe to the reader what's happening without rehashing the rules each time magic is used. And depending on how important magic is to the story, the way you write about it, let alone the actual rules of it, can make or break your story. Alright, lastly is characters. Creating characters for a fantasy book I think is more complicated to me because they usually have a more layered backstory. I don't mean like it's better or anything, I just mean there are usually more moving parts to keep track of, especially for something closer to high fantasy. You have their fantasy race and their powers, and also their social status. Usually you'll have royalty or some other kind of system. You also have their allegiances or their factions. You have their alliances and their enemies, and of course, the lost heir of the throne, who is also the savior of the land and a total badass. Sorry, I don't make the rules. I guess for writing fantasy, it feels more like you have to juggle these things between character relationships than in something like contemporary. So that's what makes it different to me. Fantasy is also more prone to having a larger cast of characters, especially high fantasy. High fantasy is really just like fantasy on steroids. You have all your fantasy elements, they're just kicked up to 11. I think you're also more likely to have more intense characters with sci-fi or fantasy. Like, I don't know, you have more warrior characters usually. Or like in fantasy, you probably have at least a few characters that are royalty. So their personalities are just more likely to be stronger, I think. They also have a higher chance of having bigger stakes on their shoulders, like, the fate of the realm or whatever. So I think that's just bound to make someone a little bit high-strung. And when you have a lot of those characters together, they can all have very intense personalities. Also, people with super powerful magic, like most main characters, are probably more likely to have or attain throughout the story a different, stronger, maybe more intense personality type. So those are my takes on how writing fantasy is different. Drop a like if you agree with any of these, and let me know what I missed. If you'd like to dive into the world of Alexia, you can check out Age of the Gods, which is a free short story I'll have linked down below. Alright, that's all I got for you, so thanks for watching. Bye!